All right, 6 o'clock. So we'll get started. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight is the third and final session of the Learn Your Land webinar series. Thank you all for joining us again on this beautiful evening. Hope everyone had a great week. I was able to get outside, enjoy the weather, and maybe do a little bit of mapping homework. And glad to have everyone back. Again, we'll get started here. We have all 7 panelists with us tonight. We've got a lot of information to get through, so we'll try to keep it succinct. But please feel free to continue using that chat box. We will have time dedicated at the end for questions and answers. So if it is something you want to ask one of our presenters, feel free to write that down and bring it up later on. Or if it's something that might be able to be answered real quick, throw that in the chat box and one of us will be moderating that as well. So tonight's session, we'll be getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of everything we've been talking about. Again, continuing to narrow this down even further and getting into specific land management techniques. So just a quick outline overview of what we're going to cover tonight. We'll touch base on the session 2 homework, the inventory and the more detailed map that you all worked on. After that, I will hand it over to Beth Russell, and she will discuss maintaining water bodies and buffers. Following that, we have Mike Fargione, who will give his presentation on managing your wild landscape. We'll take a quick 5-minute stretch break, and if there's a couple of questions after Beth and Mike's presentation, we could have a little time for that there. And then finally, the second half of the evening, we'll turn it over to Joyce, and she will be discussing managing your marginal landscape and your home landscape. And then we will have a good 15-20 minutes at the end for discussion or any questions and answers. And then I'll wrap it up with just some next steps. And again, just wanted to encourage you all. We will have an evaluation for the series as a whole. And I'll email that out following the session, and it'll also be on the landing page. So again, really encourage you to take 5 minutes to fill those out. They're really helpful for us. So looking at our homework from session 2, how did we do? Was the checklist useful? Did you guys create your own checklist? If the natural resources checklist that Nate and I showed was maybe not encompassing enough for what you have? How was navigating the online mapping tools? Were you able to use parcel aerial access and Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper? And then were there any other technical difficulties? Were you able to elaborate on those initial maps and identify further features on your property? So we'll just do a quick poll here. I have 2 questions I'll just throw out to the group. So again, there are 2 questions. Make sure you slide down on the slider bar there on the right. The first question, so while doing your homework this past session, were you able to utilize the mapping tools demonstrated last session? And then the second question, for the inventory activity, did you use the natural resources checklist provided to you, or a different checklist, or combination? So take a minute or 2 to answer those polls. All right, we got a little over half coming in. We'll just take a few more seconds and wrap that poll up. All right. So let's see. Great. It looks like about half of you were able to use the tools. A few of you could use some more instruction on them. Great. Yeah, I mean, we definitely realized that it was a lot of material to cover real quick, and that's a lot of information that we could probably put into a whole nother session on those tools. So great. And for the natural resources, for the inventory activity, great. So a lot of people did find the checklist provided useful. Glad to see that. And a few created their own and used a combination. Excellent. Well, great. Glad to see that those homework activities were useful for everyone. And again, we encourage you to use these as examples, but feel free to elaborate on these, to go off and make your own checklists, whatever is useful for you. So kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of the presentations tonight, we've kind of been continuing to follow this matrix here, this step-by-step chart. And after last session, we were at step 3, and we inventoried what we had, and we elaborated on that sketch, including more detail. And then going from tonight and then on beyond, we encourage you to move on to step 4 and to step 5, where listing potential management projects, prioritizing those, and then elaborating further one last time on that map, or creating a new map altogether that shows some of those projects and the potential outcomes of your management goals. And then finally, again, we're wrapping it up tonight, but we encourage you all to continue on even after this webinar series to realize those goals. This is an exercise, but we hope it's of use to you all, and that it really encourages you to go out and take some action. So tonight, our three main presenters will be covering maintaining water bodies and buffers. That'll be Beth Russell, who I'll introduce here momentarily. We'll have Mike Fargione discussing the wild landscapes, so our forested lands and others. And then we'll turn it over to Joyce, as I mentioned, to talk about our marginal lands and our home landscape as well. So a lot of material to cover. So we're going to try to stick as close to time. And again, we'll save most of the questions till the end. So with that, I'd like to introduce Beth Russell. Beth is the tributary conservation specialist with the Hudson River Estuary program in Cornell University. And Beth is definitely an expert in everything riparian, so really looking forward to her presentation. So Beth, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll stop sharing the screen here.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if it's coming up. Okay, hold on. All right. You should be seeing my presentation now.
Yep,
Okay.
Looks great, Beth.
All right. Okay, there we go. Hold on, I got to minimize you. All right, hi everybody. My name is Beth Russell, and I am the stream buffer coordinator for the Hudson River Estuary program. And Nate has already introduced you to the Hudson River Estuary program. And I work with our streams and watershed team. And I also am affiliated with Cornell University Water Resources Institute. And so, so this section of this training is talking about actual management on the ground, but I do want to back up and do some concepts just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the watershed concept is this idea that water sheds off the land. And so the things that you're in the stream are going to reflect what is happening on the land, and even more so the land that's closest to those streams or lakes or wetlands. I also wanted to point out that waters are interconnected. And so what you're seeing, so I put that little, that small house in the middle of this, this picture here. What that person at that house is seeing is going to reflect what's happening upstream, but also they're going to be affecting what's happening downstream. The other thing I hear a lot, people say, well, I have this little small intermittent stream. It doesn't really have water all the time. Those small streams and wetlands really do count in what affects what's happening downstream and the sort of character of watersheds in general, because the majority of the water that ends up in the Hudson actually comes from those headwaters. It actually enters the system there. So don't discount those. Those are important too. And as I mentioned before, we all live upstream and downstream, so it's good to think about your neighbors, even the ones that you don't necessarily know when you're thinking about it. The other thing that I always like to start with is, and I am talking about streams in this particular slide, but it also applies to wetlands and lakes and things like that that have changing water levels all the time. These systems are naturally really dynamic, and they tend to be what humans think of as messy, right? So they're systems that we're not necessarily totally in control of. And I think when you think about what you're going to be putting on the land and what you're going to change, you want to keep that in mind, and what your goals are. Make sure you're not fighting against that sort of naturally messy system. And also, Nate mentioned riparian buffer layer that's in the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. You can see that here on the right side of your screen, zoom into that. I just wanted to sort of just quickly mention what, so riparian is just a natural, or it's a fancy word for next to water. And so, but if you look underground in a riparian area, that area that influences the water the most, that land is going to have slightly different water dynamics and soils, and probably different vegetation if it's allowed to grow wild as it naturally would. And so that interface between land and water body is going to be a lot stronger in that riparian buffer, or I'm sorry, riparian area. And when we talk about a buffer, we're talking about where we've decided to, leave some room between what humans are doing and what's happening in the water. So thinking about that buffer, and I think just seeing this map and knowing it's not always like, when there's a very steep area, the buffer, the riparian zone might not be as wide. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't put something wide in, but it does vary a whole lot depending on what's surrounding that water body. And that map can help you think about what's happening near you. And I'm guessing most of the people on this webinar probably already know a lot of this, but I think when you're thinking about the goals for what you're going to maintain and how you're going to maintain it, you want to think about what those natural functions are of the streams, the wetlands, and the buffers, and making sure that what you're choosing is also supporting those functions if you can. So water quality, so anything we do on the land, like I said, ends up in the water. Thinking about drinking water, swimming, any of those kinds of things, what we do will affect that. Groundwater recharge, so if we can get the water going into the ground, it will actually support base flow in streams. Like a lot of water that comes up when we have drought times is from that groundwater. Flood control, in a million different places all over the watershed, make a difference to flood control. And flood is normal, flood is natural, but I think what humans have done to the land has increased how fast the water goes off the land, and we get these big spikes of flood that aren't necessarily sort of what a natural wild watershed would give us. So, thinking about that, like holding on to that water for a little bit longer before it goes into a stream, runs off the land. Erosion control, you can think about this as keeping your land and not losing it into the stream. Wildlife habitat, I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but wow, riparian areas are so valuable. Like it's that place where wildlife water, but also can get to where it needs to be for other types of needs. It's also a corridor, it follows those streams around, and we see vast, unique wildlife in these riparian corridors. Some studies have shown that it improves property values to have really healthy buffers along your stream. So not to have a stream that looks like it's dirty and messy. And I shouldn't say messy because messy is what we want, but that the stream that's not looking healthy. And recreation and education opportunities are really, there's very many of them along the stream, and that could be fishing or that could be kayaking, depending on what you're interested in. So when we think about what we want on our buffer, we might want to look at a reference site, like what does a healthy buffer look like? And they're wide. And there's a paper out there that's looked at a lot of the literature and says that the minimum of what you want is 100-foot buffer. And I know a lot of people say, oh my God, I don't even have that much land. But that's the ideal. Like we're really looking 100 and maybe 300 if what your goal is wildlife. So just think about it that way. Like these streams really naturally take up a lot of space, and their riparian areas cover a lot of space. So the more width you can give it, the more likely you're going to get those natural responses. Many types of natives, many sizes of plants. I mentioned that it looks messy. If you're looking at this picture we have here, there's low stuff and high stuff, and there's a tree and it's not exactly straight. Like thinking about those kinds of things, and maybe managing and allowing for some things to be a little bit quote unquote messy. Shade, depending on the size of the stream, you might be shading out the whole stream. You might be just doing the edge habitat, but it tends to dense cover with lots of different things. Leaf litter, you know, the natural leaf litter that comes off these plants feeds the natural insects that we have in the stream, which feed the fish. And I also have this picture of a down tree, which provides some valuable habitat for fish. So, you know, even that is sort of a messy thing that people often want to remove those things. And if they're not doing any damage to your property, having a tree and its roots down in the water actually is valuable habitat for fish. So here's a picture of a healthy stream, and we tend to not, it's hard to sort of see where buffers are in streams when they're like this, because it's just, it's woods with the stream in the middle of it. And that's great. Here's from above, we're seeing sort of two versions of buffers. There's a narrower one on the left-hand side, and that's not, you know, it's better than nothing. But on the right-hand side, we're seeing a much wider buffer with a little more diversity of plants. And so that would be even better. And you're gonna, if you want more wildlife and more of those functions, you're gonna get more from the left than from the right. But we know that sometimes it's not possible to get as wide a buffer as you might be ideal. So we'll start with the negatives. I just want to talk about a few things. Most of you probably know these things, but just good to keep in mind when you're thinking about things. So building berms or walls along streams is really something we don't want to do. And I think, you know, even from a safety point of view, when you build a berm, you have this sense that you're safe behind it. But when they tend to go dramatically and cause a lot more damage than a slow flood. Building or paving near a stream, that's what I was talking about, where, you know, we're running the water off too fast and too much, and maybe we're putting some pollutants on it. Changing or filling the stream path, like moving streams around, you never know what you're going to do. If you move a stream here, it might change what happens downstream, upstream. You might quote unquote fix what's happening in your area of the stream and really cause problems downstream. So really thinking hard about that and getting help before you do anything like that. Ditching or piping water into the stream. And this one, I think people know this, but I think that also, you know, when you're thinking about planting, people often will say, well, there's a little bit of sitting water and I don't really want that here. You know, sitting water next to streams might be really natural. That might be sort of a, you know, a sort of wetland near the water. So filling that area or trying to really quickly ditch that water into the stream is going to, you know, sort of counteract what's naturally happening. Mowing down to the stream, I think most of us know that. Dumping debris and clippings. And so I said that, you know, your leaves and the branches and things like that are naturally good for the stream. But if we dump huge piles of them or put them close to the stream, what happens is you end up clogging up the stream all at once during a flood. So in general, we don't want to be putting all of those things into the stream. That's not a good place to get rid of sort of your yard waste. And then probably most of you aren't doing this, but allowing livestock or vehicle into the stream is not good. So here's just some pictures. And I think, you know, going from the top, that mowed area, you can see how it's eroding, and those you know, lawn is green, but it's not, it doesn't have the kinds of roots that hold on to the bank the way that woody plants do, or even native grasses that are allowed to get tall. You can see all these geese who are really enjoying this deck area along those rocks, and you will get more geese around when you don't have any kind of cover on the edge. And there are some trees there, but it's not really a dense cover, right? And we're not seeing lots of different things, and there's a lot of hardened area. You can see a wall that's fallen down. And then this lower right-hand corner, you know, there are some trees on this, but there's a big lawn, right? And there's a big straight path from that house down to that lawn. And so it's not, maybe it's not all bad, and maybe that's better than nothing, but I think that that's really striving for that very tidy appearance. And maybe you can reduce the amount of that, or put in at least some native grasses or something to improve that. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the things you're going to do. So you're going to give the stream space if you can, right? You're going to slow down and spread out stormwater. So this is the water coming off your driveway or your house. And you're going to try to get it soaked into the ground before it goes straight into the stream. And that gives it time to be filtered. Same with the septic, right? You just want to make sure your septic is working and not draining directly into the stream. So that's pretty unfriendly to your neighbors. Protect and maintain your native plants. So I guess this is one of the big ones for me, is that if you already have native plants along the stream, think about if you could be comfortable keeping them, right? Or at least keeping some of them. I think we have a tendency to have this goal of like, well, I don't want any trees, so I'm just going to cut down all the trees and then I'll put in a bunch of native shrubs. Could you keep some of those trees? Could they get limbed in such a way so that you still get to keep your view? I think, and I think this is true of any kind of management that anyone does. If there's something really good there already, so much time went into that tree growing, and thinking about keeping it if you can. Controlling invasives, I'm not going to get much into invasives, but I think that if it's possible, if it's not already too late, it really is better to have a variety of natives. And one of the reasons for that is they've shown that you know, the fish and the things that are in the stream really depend on the debris from native plants to be feeding them, much more so than invasives. So if you have huge amounts of invasives, it can be problematic. Provide access thoughtfully. So this was my way of trying to say, it's great to have paths. We want people to love your waterway. We want you to love your waterway. We want you to go down to it. But having a trail that follows the stream for miles all along, like paralleling it the whole time, is going to open yourself up to that, both the trail getting eroded, but also reducing the amount that you have vegetation that's helping the stream. So if you can think about having, perpendicular or diagonal paths that go to the stream and then leave it again, as opposed to just constantly following the stream around. And I think that's something that's pretty common for people to do because we want to be near the stream. But just, think about that access and making it some places and not everywhere. Work with your neighbors. Like I said, there's downstream and upstream. And this is it's really important. You're not going to be able to control what's coming down on your stream. And you might have some control over what comes downstream of you onto your neighbors. If you're going to make a change, you should probably talk to them and let them know. But you can also make a huge difference if you and your neighbors work together. And some of the programs that I'm going to mention at the end, if you have a small property, you might be able to join with your neighbor and get more out of those programs. Join a watershed group, especially if you have concerns about what's coming down on your stream or lake to your house. You're not going to be able to change it all yourself, and so getting involved in those groups, and maybe it's not a watershed group, maybe it's a lake group or even just the local environmental groups, maybe thinking about what's going on in those waterways. And get technical assistance, especially, and the next thing that I'm gonna show you is a sort of a bunch of different sites and ideas for management in those sites. If you have a site where you've got some major erosion happening or some major concerns and that you really think you're gonna have to make some changes in the stream, get some technical assistance. Streams are super complicated and the dynamics of water can be overwhelming. And so if you're gonna make big changes, you may even need a permit. So it's definitely, reach out and get some help in thinking about how to make those changes. So, okay, I lied. I have one more slide with lots of words in it, and then I'll go to the examples. So I know we've all been telling you this all along. Start with your goals and think about those goals as they match the restrictions. So as I was saying, this is a dynamic area. So you probably won't get perfectly straight, tall trees right next to the stream because probably that stream's gonna flood and ice is gonna come during winter. And so maybe you want your straight, tall trees a little bit farther back. But you might get some cool hanging trees that hang over the edge or something like that. But think about your goals and then trying to make sure that they're realistic given that you live in this place that might flood all the time or something like that. And again, your plants are going to need to match that. you know, there was a question last time about plant lists, and I'm happy to share a plant list, but I also really highly encourage you to look for a reference location. So look upstream or downstream on the same stream or a similar stream nearby, and what's growing there in a healthy place, right? And think about those things, because that's a great way to think about what will survive, and also what sort of belongs in those areas. So reference locations are a great way. And you can also think about how many different species are there. And that might guide you in thinking about some of that stuff. And you might not plant all of them, but still just thinking about all those things and what you might expect. So maintain diverse species and sizes. That was getting back at, you know, you can plant these areas, but if you already have something good, maintain those, try to keep some of those, and keep all these different things in there. And if you're going to plant natives, please. I totally understand if you have some invasives and they're already there and they're already doing a lot of good for erosion or something like that. But if you're going to be bringing in something new, think about bringing in something that sort of belongs in that space and is going to support the local wildlife. And I don't have time to really get into natives, but you know, ask your nursery where they got them from and what the seed source is. And if you get something more local, get it more local. It's not always possible, but the more you can do that, the better. If you're working in a place that has a lot of erosion, you might want to watch what's happening and keep an eye on it. And if it's going to be coming in and if you're having, you know, a foot erode every year, then you have to be prepared that the things you put 2 feet back in 2 years have to be ready to deal with that. And if they're not, then you might need to put some kind of temporary protection. And there's all kinds of guides for bioengineering things that can do that. I'm not going to go into that today, but if you're seeing that kind of dynamic and it's something you're worried about, you know, make sure you're dealing with it at the same time as you're planting. Add plant protection. I'm going to have another slide on that. Working phases. One of the really important things, especially in an area that's very erosive or where there's a lot of invasives nearby, if you're going to be removing stuff, you don't have a huge area that you need to maintain or huge area left bare unless you have the capacity to manage it. And so I think this is true in any kind of project. Maybe do some experiments and work your way towards it, right? See what happens when the spring flood comes, what survives and what doesn't. And give yourself some time to maintain those plants. It's kind of like a garden when you first put in, even if they're things that need to survive at that site on their own. For the first year or so, you really are going to need to help them. And this picture here shows a 3-zone approach. So maybe you want to have some area that does have lawn, but maybe you can have, you know, lawn, and then in the next zone you have a little bit more managed but less, you know, less lawn and maybe a few taller trees. And then in the area closest to the stream where we want the most protection for this stream, you can let it really grow wild and not be cutting things down. So it's a way to think about it if you don't have a lot of space and you want to use some of that space for other things. I mean, if you have 100 feet to give it, but if you don't, you can manage it that way. So here are some sites. Most of which I've been to, and I'm just going to talk about how we approach them with the landowner. So this landowner wanted to keep the view, but reduce erosion. And you can see there is a little bit of a slope and the house is up a little bit. So what we did there is we worked with them to plant pretty dense low shrubs for that erosion control. And we put a few tall trees in there that we instructed them to you know, they could prune them as they grew so that they could see through and around those trees. So we didn't do a real dense tree cover because that would have blocked their view. But so that was the way that we dealt with that one. This one is not one that I've been to, but from a guide. This is a lake management guide, and I can give you the link to it. There's lots of great pictures on this one. But if you look at this, this is a first step towards not mowing everything. They're choosing to have a no-mow zone down at the lower area. But if you want to go even farther than that, think about what's your most important view. And you could, so look at it now, and I'm going to go to the next one. You could add a few more things, some low-growing shrubs, a few trees off to the side where the view's not as good, and really sort of increasing that buffer and sort of aiming for that 50-foot vegetated area and still allowing access to your dock. and boat and things like that. And so, you know, really thinking about how you can add more without taking away from your enjoyment of it. So this, I think I already showed you this picture, but someone did send me a picture very similar to this. It wasn't this one. They said, I want to replant this. How do I fix it? And I said, that stream looks great, right? So this, to me, looks like a really healthy stream that's doing quite well. And we want to watch it. And if we see signs of some invasives coming in, I would just sort of individually remove them, or kind of watching. If we're seeing signs of new erosion happening, we might want to investigate why. But I wouldn't want to mess with this. This is super healthy looking to me. So I think that's something too, is sometimes it's better just to leave it be. I put this in here because this was a site where I was asked to come and help revegetate the buffer area. And their goal was really to protect their house. And, you know, totally honest, there's no amount of vegetation all by itself that's gonna do that work. And I personally would not want to be on the line for making sure that this stream doesn't take down that house. So there are times where vegetation will not be enough. And I think recognizing that and getting technical help, this is something where there probably would need to be some structural changes that happen. And I actually happen to know that there's something upstream happening that needed to get changed, probably to keep this from continuing to erode at this crazy pace. But just looking at the picture, you wouldn't know that. So I think that's also, you know, knowing when you're sort of, when your goals just aren't going to be matched by what you're able to do. This is one, you can see there's very little space between what's already existing and the stream, and they really wanted it to look pretty. So we really chose things that were salt tolerant, knowing that they were going to survive when that winter salt gets put on this parking lot, but also, you know, things that have nice, like lots of blooms and different colors, and really densely planted shrubs and a few trees in there. And I think in this picture, the things that have those plastic tubes on them are trees, and everything else is shrubs. And this is one, so this is an area where on either side of it are really intact, healthy forests. And so for this site, we really wanted to look at those adjacent reference sites and really match those plants as well as possible. And I'm not sure if we did it at this particular site, but one of the things I love to do is if you find a tree that's been deer eaten over and over and over again, but it's a native, right? You can recognize it somehow by the buds or something like that. If you can protect that either with a tree tube, which is what you're seeing here, or with a fence around the whole site, you're going to be able to keep that local native seed stock coming up. And so sometimes that's all you need to do. And sometimes if you have enough land and you're not, you know, causing trouble to other spaces, you might be able to move plants from one place to another, and you're keeping that very local seed stock. So it doesn't always cost lots of money. And sometimes there's an opportunity to sort of just, you know, remove the deer pressure and let it naturally revegetate too, or remove the mower pressure. And this is something that's not specific to riparian areas, but protecting new plants. Unfortunately, most of us live in places where the deer, the number of deer are at the level where it's not realistic to put small plants in the ground and expect that they aren't eaten. So this is an example. There's some examples. There's tree tubes, these plastic things. I use them a lot because of the way that I have to manage my program. You can make your own protections. What I don't have a picture of is brush piles. That's something else. If you're going to be cutting down a lot of vegetation from other areas, you can pile brush around seedlings to help reduce the chance that the deer are going to go in there. The harder you make it for the deer to get to it, the more likely. Or you can do something like this bottom picture, this border fencing. That's much more expensive, but you are going to get a lot more of that natural regeneration coming in from the trees around. And I think you want to think about how you're going to manage the area when you put that protection in. This is my last slide. So I run the Hudson Estuary Trees for Trims program. So if you have a space where you need to add some native trees and shrubs, we actually provide those for free, as well as plant protection. We'll come out and do a site assessment, which is a real bonus to people. So we'll come and walk that site with you and say, what are your goals? And talk about what makes sense to get to those goals, and give you some planting recommendations. And if you bring a group of volunteers to plant, we will come during that day and maybe help with some of the prep and help give them a demonstration about how best to plant, which many of you may know how to plant, but you might not know how to put on a tree tube. And so we'll give you those tree tubes and show you how to use them. That is for people who are in the Hudson Estuary watershed. I know that some of Dutchess County is not, but Buffer in a Bag is actually available to everyone in the whole state of New York. And for that, you get a little less of that technical help, but you do get 25 free native bare root plants. They come to you in the mail from the Saratoga Tree Nursery. And you can decide where to plant them on your own as long as you're putting them near in any waterway will count, streams, wetlands, and that's true for Trees for Trips as well. So, and I'm happy, I'm got my contact information here. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions about Trees for Trips or Buffer in a Bag or any of the things that I mentioned here, but I think we're gonna hold most of the questions to the end. Also, take my contact information and get a hold of me tomorrow or tonight.
For sure. Thank you, Beth. Yeah, and we'll be sure to pass out all the panelists' contact information for future questions. So yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat box. Beth, just for the sake of time, I'm wondering maybe you could respond to those in the chat box as we go along.
Sure, I'll do that.
Great.
Yep.
And thank you so much. Great. A lot of great information. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mike Fargione. And hey, Mike.
Hey, everybody. Let me see if I can share my screen.
So Mike is the manager of field research and outdoor programs at the Cary Insitute of Ecosystem Studies. And Mike is going to be discussing managing our wildlands. So Mike, with that, I'll turn it on over to you.
Okay. Did the shared screen come up?
Yep.
Oh, I can't see it myself.
I see your PowerPoint before you go into full slide.
Okay. There we go.
Yep.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with everybody tonight. My task is to talk to you about managing parts of the property beyond your lawn and your garden. Joyce Tomaselli is going to follow me and give you details on managing the marginal areas around your home and the home landscape. We're going to review tonight how plants and animal communities work, and we're going to talk about the techniques you can use to manage your landscape. I will focus on a scale that's probably for larger properties, but the concepts and the techniques that we'll talk about are scalable down to small lots as well. And finally, I'll have time talking about problems that could hamper your management efforts in wildlands. So differences in adaptations and life history strategies allow plants to compete with each other for resources. There are variations in light, in nutrients, in water, in climate, seasonal factors like the length of the growing season, all help to create winners and losers among plants. Light requirements is one of the most critical factors influencing plants, which plants have an advantage. Plants differ in the amount of shade they can tolerate, and this is referred to as shade tolerance. Competition and differences in adaptations like shade tolerance result in a succession of different plants that dominate a site over time. And the pattern of succession is predictable for a given site, and we use this pattern of disturbance and succession to manage plant communities. So let's turn our attention to animals as components of wildlands. To be good stewards of wildlife, we need to understand their needs. What makes a site suitable for wildlife? Wildlife need appropriate kinds and adequate amounts of food and water and cover for hiding, for feeding, for reproduction. This is true regardless of what species we're talking about, whether it be bears or deer, songbirds, salamanders. They all have requirements for food, water, and cover. The way these resources are distributed across the landscape is also important. We won't have time tonight to talk about connections between habitats, but it's another important component of good stewardship. How well the wildlife needs are met on your property reflects a lot of things: soils, topography, climate, but most importantly, it reflects the plants found in the area. So understanding how plant communities form and how they change is important if we're going to understand how long a site will be suitable for a particular tree species or a wildlife species, or how we can make changes to attract or repel different wildlife species. So this is a classic illustration of plant succession over time, starting from bare ground on the left and moving towards a climax forest on the right. The term climax refers to the final stage of succession where the dominant plant species will remain dominant unless some form of disturbance takes place. Vegetation can be set back in any of various ways depending on the type and severity of the disturbance. And after each disturbance, the process of succession will begin again. Animals with different habitat requirements will separate themselves out in space and time based on their food and water and cover requirements, and as provided by different successional stages of plants. If you look at this illustration, the bars above the plants show that the names of bird species that use different successional stages are there. So it reminds us that the animals are also part of this community, and they change over time as the plant species change over time. Our ability to create or alter successional stages becomes one of the major tools we use in managing plants and wildlife on our properties. Wildlife also separate themselves out within plant communities as well as across different successional stages. The drawings you see in this figure illustrate how 3 different local songbirds might use different parts of the same forest. At the top you see where the eastern wood pewee nests in the upper part of the canopy of a forest, but forages in the mid-canopy. In the center illustration, a black-throated green warbler forages in the upper canopy, but nests mid to low in the forest. And on the bottom illustration, the ovenbird, another warbler species, nests near the ground and forages low in the forest structure. Forests that lack the required plants or plant structures at the proper level are less suitable for wildlife species that depend on those structures. So ovenbirds may not nest in a forest that has good canopy, but not enough infrastructure down low close to the ground. A lot of our techniques that are used to manage wildlife are techniques to create suitable vegetation for the species of concern. If our goal is to support a lot of diverse wildlife, we may want to create a lot of diverse habitats. If we're trying to support a particular species or a particular group of species, then we would try to manipulate the habitats to meet the needs of those species. So I'm going to look now at some of the individual techniques that can be used to manage wildlands. People often associate cutting of vegetation with clearing for development, and therefore they see it as a poor stewardship practice. But land management, even tree harvesting using things like clear cutting, is not the same as converting land for development. Land management, when it's done properly, alters what successional stage a community is in, but it retains a functional ecosystem, whereas land conversion removes the land from being a well-functioning ecosystem. When we're dealing with wildlife management, we're often looking at plant management, changing the habitat availability of different successional stages to create those needed by the wildlife of interest. Good wildlife and good forest practices are not always pretty, but they are always ecologically sound. We should consider these when we're setting our goals and when we institute regulations that impact how we can do forest and wildlife management. When we alter habitats and other community features, there's always going to be winners and losers. We should be ready to be prepared to deal with those and anticipate them, but don't be surprised if things happen unexpectedly. And some of the winners may turn out to be species that are not welcome around our homes, even if they're welcome out in our yards or our gardens or beyond in the wild area. So consider this when planning our goals and actions. Trying to choose which practice to use is a daunting task. We can choose wildlife practices and land management practices based on a number of different criteria, but timber and wildlife goals don't always align with each other. So sometimes we have to make choices. As everyone so far, all of our presenters have talked about, we want to follow some kind of a long-term plan and base our decision on our goals, our current conditions, constraints we have, and costs. Choosing techniques need to be site specific because each site may need different practices and may require different methods to do that. The best management practices are always the best ones to use. And it's always a good idea to get professional help. Hire a professional forest consultant, a wildlife biologist to come in and give advice, to help design a plan, and maybe to actually do some of the techniques you're trying to do. And you should always investigate cost-sharing opportunities. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, the NRCS, has cost-sharing funds available for forestry and wildlife management practices. Here in Dutchess County, the NRCS office is in the Farm and Home Center, right down the hall from the Cooperative Extension. There are eligibility requirements and best management practices that may need to be followed, but it's worth talking with them to see if they can help provide expertise and perhaps share some of the costs. So the first group of practices we're going to talk about are related to individual tree selection and to creating forests that have trees of many different ages. These are the most common forestry practices used in our area. These are often intermediate steps before we go ahead and do an actual timber harvest. And if so, they're commonly referred to as timber stand improvement practices, or TSI. If your goals are the production of timber or other forest practices, TSI often involves removing poorer trees that compete with more desirable ones. You can favor more valuable species or individual trees that have a better shape or a better form, or you may be reducing the total number of trees on a stand in a thinning cut to allow space for the remaining trees to grow. TSI practices help wildlife by increasing the amount of forest that reaches the forest, the amount of sunlight that reaches the forest floor, and then helping to provide more food and cover for wildlife. More intensive types of techniques in even age stand management include crop tree and mass tree releases. For timber production, these involve identifying your desirable crop trees and releasing them from competition. For wildlife, this involves identifying trees that provide the best food or cover and favoring those. Not all trees have the ability to produce the same amount of seeds, so keeping the best can result in more food production for wildlife. These involve more severe types of cutting than other TSI practices, and so they mean more light reaches the forest floor, and there should be a responding greater increase in growth, providing more food and cover for wildlife and more regeneration for forests for the future. So cutting down trees is hard work and maybe beyond what individuals feel comfortable doing, or the site may be small and it's not economical to have a logger come in and do TSI or other work. There are alternatives to felling trees that accomplish the practices of TSI. You can girdle trees, you can apply herbicides to the bases of them, you can do a combination where you create wounds in the tree and treat them with an herbicide. These require less manual labor than actually cutting the trees. It may take several years for the trees to die. The advantage is it creates new dead trees that are standing in the forest that provide food and cover for wildlife. It also could reduce the amount of damage that occurs compared to dropping trees and they fall on their neighbors and damage them. It does, however, produce additional hazards for human activity, both now and in the future. Now you're potentially working with herbicides or other chemicals, and in the future you have a stand that potentially has a number of dead trees standing that could potentially fall and hurt somebody. So next we're going to talk about practices that are related to creating forests that are even-aged. Okay, these are not without controversy. Everyone's heard of clear cutting. It's the most famous of these practices. It refers to the removal of all of the large and medium trees in a stand. Many times, many of the small trees are also removed in this practice by the mechanical activity of the harvesting equipment. Reforestation in clear cuts is accomplished in several ways. The stumps may sprout again to produce new trees. There may be natural seed already in the seed bank in the soil, or humans may spread seed over it, or people may actually plant new seedlings in those areas. A lot of clear cutting doesn't get done here in the Northeast. Much more common is a practice called shelter wood cutting, which refers to the removal of all of the large and medium-sized trees in an area, in a block, but you leave a small percentage of valuable timber trees of the favored species. They provide seed for the next forest to grow from. You leave them for 5 to 10 years until you've had a good crop of seed produced and a number of seedlings produced in the forest floor, and then they would go back in and remove the rest of those fully mature trees to make it into an actual fully clear-cut area. On a much smaller scale, people sometimes do what's known as a patch clear cut. It's a small clearing that allows you to increase the size and the disturbance beyond what happens when you remove just a single tree. These are all techniques that are the most effective ways, and sometimes the only way, to regenerate shade-intolerant tree species. Conifers, hardwoods like aspens, birches, and even sometimes oaks. They're required to generate large, early successional habitats that are important to a lot of wildlife species, like golden-winged warblers, ruffed grouse, American woodcock. Firewood and firewood cutting, usually on a commercial scale, is done as a byproduct of the timber stand improvement practices or the harvest. Too often, homeowners consider aesthetics over function, and they clean up all the dead and downed trees in their woodlots in order to fill their firewood needs. Wildlife and wildlife ecologists love standing dead trees, and they love fallen trees on the ground. So again, you've heard this several times. Try to resist the urge to clean up your wild lands, and don't be afraid to let your forests be a little bit messy. Prescribed burns are burning of the forest or brush or grasslands to achieve either vegetative or wildlife management goals. They're not used widely here in the Northeast, but they're very common in other parts of the United States. They can be performed here in New York. They have to be done in accordance with DEC regulations, and you should contact your regional DEC office for more information if you have an interest in using prescribed burns. Let's consider some techniques that are primarily wildlife enhancement techniques, not typically part of forestry practices. The first of these is called hinge cutting. It's gotten to be immensely popular among landowners who are trying to prove habitat for wildlife, particularly game species. It involves cutting small trees just partway through and then pushing them over while they're still attached to the stump. The trees will remain alive for a few months to a few years if it's done properly, and it provides a lot of cover on the ground in both browse and cover for wildlife. It's sometimes referred to as living brush piles. It can be somewhat unsightly. You probably don't want this in your backyard, and it can make future work in that stand more difficult. I've seen places where it's been done to excess, and it actually can inhibit wildlife use if it's really overdone. Another wildlife habitat enhancement that we talk about is avoiding cutting dead standing trees wherever they can be safely retained in your forest. These dead trees are called snags, and they provide critical wildlife habitat, homes for cavity nesting birds and mammals, and food for various insects and insect-eating animals. So unless safety dictates it, leave your snag standing. Brush piles can be useful and important wildlife habitat. They are typically made from remnants of harvests, from prunings, when you clean up after a storm. Ideally, they're about 15 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and they provide shelter for lots of different wildlife. They're best built along the edges of cover, and they're most valuable as short-term solutions where there's not a lot of natural ground cover. Usually you build them by putting the larger materials on the bottom and smaller materials on top. They can attract good wildlife, and they can also attract wildlife that cause potential problems. So consider that when you're going to build them. Another very popular wildlife habitat technique is to build soft edges or cutback borders or shrub borders. They're brushy transition zones where a forest tapers to a field. They provide food and cover in a gradual transition. Typically they're 20 or 30 yards wide. There's several methods to create them. One is to stop mowing the outer edge of your field. You can plant shrubs in that outer edge that you stop mowing. Or in some cases, like you see in these pictures, what they've done is they've actually cut down some of the forest trees along the edge and let them fall into the field, so the tops land in the field. Like any other wildlife or forestry habitat, there is some maintenance involved in these kinds of practices, and you have to go in occasionally and cut down the larger trees that grow up to prevent succession from turning that edge back to a forest. Woody plantings can be important for helping to manage wild lands. They can be standalone or parts of soft edges. They provide cover and food. We want to focus on using native species. If we mix up the species, we can provide a range of different types of foods at different timings when they're available. There are select cultivars available for wildlife food, and they do require some maintenance, pruning, fertilization, perhaps weed control, and some protection from wildlife like deer and rabbits. Every old farmstead had an orchard, and that provided food for the growers. And these trees and their wild descendants can still be found in our landscape. A simple wildlife habitat improvement is to increase the fruit output of these old abandoned trees. The first step is usually to cut down competing vegetation so they get more light, water, and nutrients, and then prune them up so you remove the dead and diseased branches, and you promote new formation of new fruiting wood. You can actually over prune these trees if you try to do a lot of pruning in 1 year, so it's often better to try and do it over multiple years. Another very popular technique is to enhance wildlife use by establishing food plots. The photo here shows sorghum and corn that's been interplanted with cool season grasses here in Dutchess County at a local game club. The plot benefits many wildlife species, not just game animals. Food plots are agricultural plantings, mostly annuals or perennial crops. You have to establish them. There are maintenance requires. And one of the best ways to do this is to hire a local farmer who has the equipment and the knowledge and can create these plots and maintain them for you. I like to call pollinator plots wildlife habitat with great aesthetics. They can be small to large. You want to avoid using insecticides near them for chance of harming the pollinators you're attracting. There actually are at times funds available through NRCS to put in these pollinator plots. Seeds can be purchased through pollinator conservation groups, hunting organizations, and various catalogs. Without some form of disturbance, our open habitats here in the Northeast will quickly revert back to forest. And mowing is one of the most cost-effective ways of disturbing a site and repeatedly setting back succession so we have early habitats. You should limit the number of times you mow to a minimum that you need in order to keep the woody plants from taking over. Once a year or once every other year is usually enough to set back the woody growth, but allow you to still get in with a mower and cut without damaging the equipment. The timing of the mowing can be scheduled to reduce your impacts on wildlife and to enhance the seed production of the plants in the fields. Ideally, you mow in the fall after a frost or in the spring before the plants start to bloom and the birds start nesting. It's hard to do that in many seasons because of the weather, so late summer or early fall is often a reasonable time to do your mowing, as long as you don't do all the fields in the same time in the same year. Nest boxes are a great way to attract and help wildlife. People have a habit of removing dead trees, which reduces the natural cavities that are out there. Starlings and house sparrows will compete with native species for whatever cavities do exist. So nest boxes can really help to promote various native birds and mammals. Box design is specific to each species, as is the placement. So it's important to know what the best location, height, and aspect would be. And there is some maintenance required for nest boxes. So we're all aware of the threats that natural communities face from development and pollution, climate change, and other human-caused factors. But there's a couple of threats we need to consider when we're thinking about being good stewards. And these are invasive species, which we've talked about quite a bit, and overabundant deer populations. When we look at a forest, we often look right past the lower level and when we marvel at the big mature trees. But the understory is really critical. It's the overlooked and undervalued component of most forests. It's the next forest. It's the replacement trees that are necessary after a timber harvest or after a natural disturbance. As we've already talked about, the forest understory provides important structural habitat for wildlife. The Nature Conservancy produced some frightening analysis of the likelihood of New York forests being able to regenerate themselves a few years back. Over much of the state, the likelihood is fair to poor, and it's particularly poor here in the southeastern part of the New York area. Foresters rated the greatest threats to regenerating our current forests, and they mentioned competition from other plants and the loss of seedlings from deer browsing as being the most important factors that will prevent natural regeneration in our forests. So we've talked about discussion of issues and techniques for invasive species management, and we'll talk more about that in the next presentation, but I wanted to mention a few things. The best control is to prevent new introductions. And so I suggest people go to the Treat Smart Trade program on the Cary website to see what people are doing to try and prevent new introductions. Controlling invasive species is often necessary before you create new disturbances like thinning or harvesting. Sometimes it's required in order to obtain cost share funding. Invasive species differ in their impacts, and this may not seem intuitive, but sometimes it may be preferable to have invasives in your forest to no understory whatsoever. And it's important to pick your battles. Some invasives are abundant and beyond the ability to effectively control them, or maybe of limited harm, and again, maybe providing more benefits than harm. Finally, I want to talk about white-tailed deer, which turn out to be one of the most important threats to our wild lands. Deer are keystone species. That means they're capable of reshaping their environment. They're very selective in what they feed on. They can reduce or eliminate their preferred foods. In wintertime, when food is scarce, they will turn to eating dormant woody buds, and they'll focus their feeding on the low vegetation seedlings and lower branches in the forests and fields. Deer densities in many states, including New York, are greater now than they were before European settlement. And so the result of this is widespread damage to forest understories, a reduction in the cover for wildlife, and a loss of regeneration for the next forest. There are a variety of options for dealing with deer damage or any wildlife issue, but they fall into typically 4 categories: cultural practices and habitat manipulation, repellents and scare devices, physical barriers, and population control. The first 3 are typically used on smaller sites, although some physical barriers can be used on large areas. But we're going to talk about population control today. So a variety of methods have been used to attempt to reduce deer numbers. We don't have time to go into all of them, their benefits and shortcomings, but repeated work has shown that hunting during the established season can be the most effective way of reducing deer numbers on large landholdings with free-ranging and abundant deer. Reducing your deer population will require an annual harvest of the adult breeding age females. The opportunity to harvest a buck with antlers keeps hunters engaged, but its population control effort has to focus on removing the breeding females. So, landowners control access to deer and to hunting, and they should manage hunters. They should set annual deer harvest goals for their property. They should require hunters to apply for and take antlerless permits on doe tags. They should determine when and where hunting takes place on their property within New York state laws. They should identify hunting and parking areas, make the hunters familiar with boundaries and sensitive areas they don't want them to trespass in, require some blaze orange. Landowners can enroll their property in the DEC's DMAP program, which will allow them to get antlerless deer tags that they can give out to hunters to help control deer populations. This is hard to do on a small property, but you can coordinate efforts with your neighbors to create a bigger effect on the deer population. So I would encourage landowners to ensure your goals are accomplished and use hunting as a tool. So this has been a really quick introduction to some land management techniques. I've given Sean a number of references, and they're on the landing page for further study. And I'm happy when we have time to answer your questions, and thank you for your attention. I'll turn the screen back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, as Mike mentioned, we have a whole list of resources that he provided for us, so I'll be sure to get that up there for you all to check out. We will be taking a 5-minute break here, so if anyone wants to hop off now and come back at, let's see, it's 7:08, so come back around 7:13. We'll take a quick 5-minute break. And Mike, we did have a couple of questions in the chat box, so I don't know if you wanted to take a minute or two just to address those. One question was, how do you incentivize doe harvest by hunters? Oh, you're muted, Mike. Oh. Mike, can you hear me?
Hi there, sorry about that.
No problem.
The way to incentivize harvest of does by hunters is to make it a requirement for getting access to your property. It may mean you have to require them to bring the animals they harvest to you and show you that they've done it, but it's very effective. People want places to hunt, and they're willing to go through a lot of hoops to get them. And so making that a requirement in order to gain access to hunting is a very effective way to get them to take antlerless animals.
Okay, and we got another question from Charles. So his question, hunting seasons have generally begun and ended according to the calendar for many, many years. It's my experience and opinion that deer rut breeding season has adjusted, as has deer behavior to avoid these seasons. I don't have exact numbers, but I believe harvests have become much lower. And his question is, will there be any influence to modify those seasons?
The current hunting season in New York, in our area, starts October 1st with bow hunting and runs to the end of, well, the middle of December. And so it covers the entire period of the pre-rut and rut and some of the post-rut. It certainly changes each year when those events take place, but there's typically plenty of opportunities to harvest animals if you're willing to go through different seasons and different types of weapons in order to harvest an animal. Those are questions for state biologists, and I'm not sure I can answer what their plans are, but these hunting seasons have been established for many years, and I haven't heard nothing about them changing in the near future.
Thanks, Mike. So we will we'll get back started here in just a couple minutes. So stretch your legs if you need to. All right. Well, I'd like to introduce and welcome as everyone's coming back, I'd like to introduce and welcome our last, but certainly not least presenter of the evening. I'd like to introduce Joyce Tomaselli, who is a community horticulture resource educator and my colleague at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County. And Joyce also manages our Master Gardener Volunteer Program and she is an all-around expert in everything to do with lawn, invasives, gardens. I forget, Joyce, how many diagnostics you said today when we were talking you've been up to now, but oh, you're muted, Joyce. But she has all the answers.
So May I had 100 diagnostic calls, and the first 9 days of June I had 68 diagnostic calls, and everyone wants to talk.
Oh yeah. Well, you're the person to talk to. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joyce, and take it away. And no.
Okay. So you have to stop sharing?
Yep. Let me just do that.
Cool.
You should be good sharing.
Wait a minute. I have to get to where I can share. Yeah. Share screen. There we go.
Perfect.
Yay. Okay, so love your land. And I'm going to be talking about several things here, and I'm going to try and do it in as succinct a way as possible because the topics are huge. So I'm going to talk about that marginal landscape, leaving the forest and coming into where we live and play in the context of invasives, a short comment about ornamental alternatives, and a little bit of a sidebar about ticks, because that is important in that marginal landscape. Then I'm going to go over your home landscape, and we could take weeks to do this, but we'll take about 15-20 minutes. So again, I'll try and hit the high points and give you resources on what you can consider. We teach a lot of this to home gardeners. We teach a lot of it to master gardeners. And also, I'm going to teach you a little bit because of my own experience with my own land. I live in the town of Clinton. I'm on 14 acres. The town of Clinton was mostly dairy farms. Every mile you can find the old farmhouse, and that's because there's almost no agriculturally important land in the town of Clinton, and what was good ag land got houses built on it behind Stewart's. Most of my area here is still very wooded. We have lots of birds and wildlife. I compete with my friend who's a birder on who has what birds when. The hunter that has a deer cam on my land calls me when he sees the bobcat. So we're really very fortunate with where we are. There's way too many deer, but it still is very rural. I live in that sort of little wooded area there. This is where I am, and there's the Wappingers Creek. And there's the power lines that thankfully I don't see that cut straight through the town of Clinton that some people are growing things under now, which is very cool. Right, the hill behind me, you can see 360 degrees because it's so tall. And there's our property. And this is conserved land. And this is very cool because what we have is we do have wildlife corridors that go back to a pond here and enjoy all of these woods that are connected. You can see not that much is cleared. This is a field that's mowed after the bobolinks stop nesting. Oops. I do have what I call a wetlands. This may be called a stream. Beth, it's only 2 feet wide. In a flood, it's 4 feet wide, and it dries up about 2 weeks from now. So, but it does make this whole bottom of my property a wetland. And from, whoops, back way, from the stop it, from the, page up, there we go. From the 360 degree view here, which is there, down to the stream, it drops over 80 feet in about 700 feet. So I have a slope that I'm dealing with that makes it very interesting for many reasons. We live on rock, and I'm also one of the few places in Dutchess County that's zone 4. So we'll talk about that when we're planning. The backyard where we are is more formal, and that's where I have more ornamental plantings, and that's where I mow, and that's where we compete with the bird feeders. I have an area that I have stopped mowing that I only mow in autumn, and that has nice goldenrod, that has milkweed, that has all sorts of pollinators and some poison ivy. But I'm started making my own little meadow between where I want to be in short grass and where we go into the forest. I do have a lot of invasives along the driveway and in the wetland. These are dead and dying elms. These are multiflower rose. There are blackberries. There's no wineberries. And my driveway goes over the creek. So I did pave near the creek, Beth, sorry about that, but it goes over the creek before it goes up to the hill. And that's going to be one of my challenges as I talk about plans for managing. Invasives. That margin between the managed and forest and the managed lawn or gardens is really where you have a lot of invasive species. The first thing you've got to do in terms of managing invasive species is know what they are. And here's a couple of resources. The DEC 5 years ago, and they're updating this, has prohibited and regulated plants that can no longer be sold or can only be sold away from wetlands and places where they might escape. And those are the bullies. That's the multiflora rose, that's the euonymus, that's the bittersweet, that's a bunch of the trees, that's some of the forbs. Also, the Lower Hudson Partnership for Invasive Species Management, Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, has another list of things of special concern in the Hudson Valley. Those are not only the established invasives, but emerging invasives that are a special concern, that if we manage those aggressively now, we can keep them from becoming so well established like some of the old traditional invasives that we're struggling with in our properties. With plant identification, you need to know what you're looking for, what you're looking at, and you need to get practiced on very specific things, especially in that marginal space, which may be trees or might be shrubs or might be vines. You need to look at very classic botanical characteristics, and an alternate branching tree with a compound leaf in an entire margin with samaras for seeds and panicle flowers is tree of heaven, which is one of the really big concerns right now about an invasive species. Tree of heaven was brought in the 1880s as an ornamental to the East Coast and then the West Coast. It comes from Asia, I believe, and it is now the preferred host for the invasive insect called spotted lanternfly. So one of the things I'm doing is helping build skills for citizen scientists to go out and scout for ailanthus and then scout for spotted lanternfly. And before I started teaching invasives, I got myself all goofed up walking the road that I've walked on for 30 years, trying to figure out the difference between the different trees that I had. And it turns out it's super easy. Ailanthus has a node at the bottom of each one of these leaflets. That's all you've got to remember. You look at the compound leaf, you look for that node by the way it smells, and when you then also see that it has these samaras, which are seeds that can persist even through till next spring on some trees, you know you've got tree of heaven. If you, oh, and by the way, when you are concerned about invasives, you need to know how they spread, because that's going to help you understand how to manage them. Tree of heaven spreads with seeds, and also if it's cut down, for example, or if it's disturbed, or just if it's happy, it sprouts new trees from its roots. So you've got to sneak up on ailanthus if you want to remove it, in that you damage the bark and use a systemic herbicide in autumn when the nutrition is being brought down into the roots, so that you're damaging the roots so they can't resprout. We could spend 5 hours on invasives, but those are some of the basics. What does it look like? Where is it? Why is it invasive? How should it be managed? Why should it be managed? Etc. Lookalikes. Black walnut, the bark is different. The leaves don't have that node. The fruit is different. So in Mike teaches leaf scars, even in winter, you can tell the difference between a black walnut and an ailanthus. Similarly, oriental bittersweet is one of the bullies that we have in many of our forests and many of the forest edges. It has alternate leaves, and the new growth ones often are a slightly different shape than the older growth ones. It has the vine that goes up and binds around the tree. And right now, if you're walking in the forest, you can see the new vines that are growing from seeds, and they twirl on each other and they start trying to find something that they can hang on to. They're really easy to pull now. Mature vines are harder to get rid of. Similar to ailanthus, you would do it with a cut and paint method that in autumn would bring a systemic herbicide down to the roots. Whatever you do, try and keep the vines from getting large enough to bear fruits, because that's how they spread. It spreads by seed. There are a lot of resources that are available. I've mentioned the Lower Hudson Prism several times. Several of us are members of it. There's a lot of education. The New York Botanical Society, New York Botanical Garden has a very good book that shows the plants that are invasive compared to their native lookalikes. Similarly, volunteers and projects have been created in Lower Hudson Prism that do the same thing. You can go and take training on the species of the invasive species of special concern. Similarly, you'll see on my last slide, I didn't scroll down here, there is a 75-page document that's on this site that gives best management practices using cultural methods if you don't want to resort to chemicals or if you're managing a property where you can't. So when you're removing invasives, another key thing besides how they spread, besides knowing the best way, do you pull, do you mow, do you smother? I like to mow the barberry in late summer because it sets up new shoots in fall, and then the deer eat them in winter. And then I mow it again in spring. Eventually you mow something enough, or you cut it at the base frequently enough, you will exhaust the roots and the plant will not be able to survive. Consider when removal is most effective. There's other things like Japanese knotweed. There are some new ideas on dealing with that by getting it to constrict itself by putting wire mesh over it. Whenever you have a management plan for removal, you really need to have a management plan for replacement because, thank you, Julie, nature abhors a vacuum. And when you pull things out, you are disrupting the seed bank, you have new seeds coming in, and you have often new invasives coming in more aggressively than the other plants that you want to encourage. So if you remove, you must replace, or you'll just have more invasives activity. When you're removing invasives, consider native ornamental alternatives. We have a 2 to 3 hour presentation we give about ornamental alternatives to invasive species, and that's the CCE Master Gardeners. And we built it because we wanted to help people understand that a lot of these invasives were introduced for ornamental purposes years ago, decades ago. And we do have native plants that have similar characteristics that could be replaced, that can replace them. All native plants are not necessarily perfect. Some don't compete as well. Some have very niche areas. There are some good species and genus that aren't native that are also really good plants. But try and consider natives first. And these are just some of the examples of information that we've created that I'll share. In fact, I think I sent it to Sean to share, and it talks about the characteristics, if it's deer resistant, if it's supporting pollinators, etc. So make a plan and do consider replacing things with native alternatives. How's that for fast? The next thing to think about in terms of this marginal management is ticks. The area where ticks are is often in that transition from your managed forest to your managed property or lawn or gardens. There are a lot of resources at Don't Get Ticked New York, which was created a couple of years ago by Cornell, New York State Integrated Pest Management, and it has claymations and it has lots of information, but here's a few highlights. The whole point we teach is don't get bitten by a tick. Then you're not going to need to be concerned about tick-borne diseases and how to deal with them. Don't get bitten by a tick by knowing where they are and by avoiding it. And the margins are prime locations. Last year, I got really late in the year and I took the mower and I just sort of shot all the leaves into the woods, and rather than chopping them up and spreading them for mulch like I normally do. And about 2 weeks later, a research paper came out pointing out that made really good tick habitat all the way around my property between the lawn and the woods. Know that they need blood, that ticks quest. They quest from foliage on the ground. They don't jump or fly or drop from trees. They are waiting for you or an animal to brush by. And Lone Star ticks that are starting to be seen in our Dutchess County and have also been found in counties further to the south are more active hunters than the other two. They have preferred habitats. The black-legged tick, which used to be called the deer tick, but deer is just as much a victim as anybody else. The black-legged tick tends to hang out more in the woods and in long grass. The American dog tick is probably the favorite one if you find one, because it carries the least diseases and it tends to be on the edge. When I walk my dog, I almost always find American dog ticks. But if I'm in the woods or where it's cooler, that's where you're going to see black-legged. The Lone Star, sadly, likes all three areas. And so in all cases, we don't get ticked by doing a couple of things. Avoid tick hotspots. So when you're working in your woods, when you're managing in your woods, be aware of where they are, and of course use physical protection. Ticks need hosts. And so my bird feeder attracts birds and squirrels, and I got to think about that, where I put it, because that could also be attracting ticks. So that's over sort of on the side of my area. It's not of my backyard. It's not where I would sit out in the evening and have dinner. There are a lot of resources that I'm not going to go through, but they include how you can inspect your lawn, how you can analyze, sorry about the clock, it's only half, how you can analyze and how you can do some inspection. Net. When you're outdoors, when your family's outdoors, when your dog's outdoors actually, there are repellents that are labeled for ticks. Some of them seem more safe, like oil of lemon eucalyptus, but it doesn't last as long. So whenever you use a repellent, make sure that you read the label to see how you need to reapply it. I tend to not like to put stuff on my skin, but I'll spray repellents on my shoes and on my hat, and if I'm wearing pants on my legs and on my jeans. You can also use permethrin treated clothing. You can treat your own. You can buy it treated. And one of my master gardeners, who's a really little itty bitty thing, has her small sizes clothes that are her favorites. You can send them out to be treated. And that is not only a repellent, but it is an acaricide where it kills the ticks. So you have a lot of options that are available and have been described, including discussion about when you manage your landscape, that you should keep bushes trimmed and remove branches and leaf litter in the area where you're hanging out most often in your backyard, your front yard with your family, to keep the lawn mowed a little bit shorter there. And there's also some good advice, most specifically, as I talk about the marginal land between the woods and your landscape, is have a dry area either with stones or wood chips or something that keeps the ticks on the other side of that where it's moist and shady, and keeps this area where you're enjoying your lawn drier and shorter and tick-free. How's that for a short one on ticks? There's a lot of information. So that I think was yes, that's the three things on marginal. So managing your landscape, I've got a couple of different things I want to talk about here. You've done property sketches for a couple of the sessions early. I think when you think about managed landscapes, there's a couple more things you need to think about because you're doing digging and you need to think a little bit more about things. So obstructions above and below. Know where your septic is. Don't plant a food vegetable garden on top of your septic. It may be the best flat place with the most sun, but that's not a place where you want to plant things for food. I don't know how many times I've cut my cable, 3 now, as I dug something. No cable, no electrical above, below, etc. And mark that on your map. Truly, truly, truly no sun and shade. Take a weekend, take a camera, go out in spring and fall and summer, and know where you have sun and know where you have shade. And when you've been in a home for 30 years or more like I have, realize that what used to be sun has probably gone to more shade as the trees have grown up. So when you don't understand why things are growing the way they used to, you probably don't have the amount of sun that you used to. Hardiness in microclimates. You can zoom in on the USDA zone map now and see exactly what your hardiness zone is. You can think about microclimates because if you spend the time digging holes in rock and planting trees or shrubs, and 2 or 3 years later they get wiped out in a colder winter, that's frustrating and discouraging, and you might not do it again. Same thing with wind. In spring, I see more wind damage of boxwoods than people realize because they didn't realize what a cold wind can do to desiccate shrubs. If you're trying to garden or you're trying to grow things in your managed landscape, think on where the soil historically has been compacted. It's very hard to decompact soil and to grow things in it. The farm house up on the corner on Oak Grove, a road used to go on one side of it and now it goes on the other side of it. A couple hundred years later, that still doesn't grow grass very well because it is so compacted. Know where your drainage is. Poor drainage kills a lot of things. I've had 3 calls this spring where bad drainage from last year killed mature oaks because they got root rot and they just collapsed, and they were very big old oak trees that we would imagine are impervious, but they got phytophthora root rot. So good drainage, bad drainage is certainly important to know about. Understand your soil characteristics. Understand if you've got clay, if you've got shale, if you've got loam. Depending on what it is you want to grow, you really need to understand your soil, and you need to mark where your soil is, and you need to go around with a shovel and dig and see what your soil is. Think about slopes. I said I've got really bad slopes coming from the property behind us, coming down to the back of the house, and then sloping down the front yard, and then really ditching down the driveway. So I have to think about erosion, I have to think about water. And certainly think about wildlife interference. I've got deer, so unless I physically restrict the shrubbery and the food gardens, they're going to eat it sooner or later. Sooner or later, it's going to get hot enough and dry enough in the summer, or sooner or later, it's going to get cold enough in winter that they're going to eat what they can reach, especially if it's small before it gets larger when you first established it. Think about what existing plants you have. Again, this is a little bit marginal, but this is also look around when you first buy or when you're first managing things, see what existing plants you have. And if you've got a couple of trees that are crowding a really good tree, then trim around it, see what it is you need to protect. This is an example of a book from a Cornell professor that gives a lot of information about site assessments and managing your landscapes. With us here, now when I was listening to Beth and Mike, I cringed a little bit, but so far what we've done is when we first bought the land, there were 2 natural clearings, and that's because it was rock. And so we sited the house in one natural clearing and the garden in the other. Well, we had to blast for the foundation. And after trying to garden and pick rocks for 15 years, I finally put in raised beds. We knew we would have water challenges from this high hill here. And so we did put in foundation drains that ditch out beyond the septic into this nice wooded area. So it's 700 to 800 feet before it gets down into this little creek. We have a really good well. But until recently, we did have problems with runoff, and I'll tell you what I did with that. I use fencing, I mow the lawn near the house, I mow the rest of the fields with a bush hog, and I try and time it where I'm not messing up with the pollinators. And I told you that I am encouraging and do see that this is a nice wildlife corridor. Right now, I've left these wetlands alone because I have no idea how to manage them. I've learned more today. And I guess someday when I get to retire, I've got a nice project coming. We did put in solar and geothermal, which caused us to take down some trees here. There's 3 big trackers. I would have a lot more solar generation because this is due south if I took out these trees, and I just don't want to do it. We have enough to run the house as it is, and I would rather keep this wooded area for the wildlife. We did pave the driveway, but way up top here is where we ditched off the water, so we have 700 feet down before it naturally gets down into that creek, and I don't have a problem with water running down anymore. I do have ash trees dying. Last summer, we took out 15 to 20 only because they were near the house or barn. So in the future, I've got to deal with the woods. Each time I'm doing something, I'm trying to add native shrubs and hit the wrong button, and just trying to deal with making some changes, including the wetlands and decreasing the lawn. What I found here is where the septic is here and it goes downhill fast. I'm establishing a lot of shrubs here that can take part sun to shade. So if you're gardening, if you're managing your landscape and you're trying to plan for ornamentals or for gardening for food, here's some key considerations. And I tell you this because I can't tell you how many people have called me this spring saying, I started a vegetable garden. I'm wondering, fill in the blank. For food, you have to have sun. You have to have access to water. You're going to need to water it. You're not going to want to haul buckets of water to the other side of your property. You have to have access to water. You need to know your soil. You need to select plants that are going to suit your environment. You're going to need to know what can be in spring, what can be in summer, why you start tomatoes and peppers early indoors. It's because they take so long to mature that you wouldn't have fruit, or you'd have it just as the first frost hit. You want to understand how to compost. You want to understand where to use compost as a mulch, as an amendment. For anything that you plant, you need to know that there are specific pests and specific diseases of specific genus and species. If it's a peach, you're going to have different pests than if it's an apple. If it's a wild cherry and a sweet cherry or a sour cherry, it's going to be similar pests. It's going to be different if it's squash, but it's going to be the same if it's potatoes and tomatoes. Are those both solanaceous? Yes, they are, and eggplant. I'll show you some resources. If you're growing food, you're going to want to think about succession planting. What can you plant in spring, like beets and lettuce? Now that the lettuce is going to seed, what can you put in that spot instead? Because remember, nature abhors a vacuum, and you'll just get weeds instead. Weed management, wildlife management, harvest. It's not that different when you're gardening for ornamentals. It's just that you have to know a little bit more about some different plants. There are more ornamentals that can grow in shade. There are more that are drought tolerant. There are more that are pollinator friendly. You need to understand what you are growing as an annual, as a perennial. You need to know how to choose them, how to plant them. You still have to have all the rest of the aspects on water, soil selection, compost, diseases. You don't have as much harvest. So knowing that and understanding that is really important for when you are trying to manage your land and manage it for what purpose. So there's a lot of different resources that Cornell and CCEs have available. Pour a cup of coffee and read. The Cornell Guide to Growing Fruit at Home, I think that one's 117 pages. It's online. It's really good. It's useful. Spend the winter learning so that you can spend the summer successfully managing your landscape for whatever reason you want. Next, I want to talk about lawns. Okay, I'm going to go a little more quickly. Lawns didn't used to exist until medieval England and Europe. It was easier to find bandits and monsters by having cleared areas outside your castle. And by the 16th century, it was a sign of wealth because you had to maintain all of this by hand by servants. It was mowers throughout history could be sheep. They could be horse-drawn, they could be motorized, they could be pushed by a 12-year-old. But one of the big differences in the United States was after World War II, when more people were able to afford new houses, they were coming back from the war, there was the baby boom. There were several designers that created new communities that included lawns, and that was new and different. There was around Chicago, more and more places started establishing lawns, and so it became your duty if you've got a lawn, right? You have to keep it nice. If Scott's has a 4-step fertilizer program, you better do all 4 steps, or you're not following the instructions and having a nice lawn as well as your neighbor. Here's some cool mowers from 1951 and 1950 that were also created as people had lawns as their societal statement. There are a couple of really good resources on Cornell, turf grass lawns. It's easy to read. Here are some of the highlights. Lawn is not bad. Lawn is good. There are good things about not having as much lawn, but lawn does good things. It gives us a place to play. It does good things for our environment. At the end of the day, the best things you can do for your lawn is mow it high. It requires less fertilizer and water, and it shades out weeds. Use a mulching mower. Leave the clippings on the lawn where they can nicely disintegrate, decompose, and now it's adding more substance to your soil, and it's adding a nice protection to your roots to keep them cool, and it just helps the blades. In fall, go ahead and mow the tree leaves and leave a loose, fine layer on top of your grass, and that decomposes. The most important thing to know is your lawn's seasonal growth. When it, a few weeks ago, started really growing quickly, you have a lot of blade and a lot of root. That's where it's establishing its strength, and that's when you want to do your mowing. When it starts getting into heat in the summer and your blades get shorter, your roots are getting shorter. Notice how you have the same above and below. That's the worst time you can fertilize. Because if you fertilize now, you're going to cause a whole bunch of growth to your blades without having the subsequent ability to grow with your roots. In fall, like all plants, when plants are bringing nutrition down to their roots, that's when you would fertilize. So forget the fertilize 4 times a year if you feel you must do it in fall, and understand how and when to mow. Choose the right grass. If you really want something that's gorgeous, you can do Kentucky bluegrass. It's hard to do, it's hard to maintain, it requires too much water. The best thing you can do is have a mix of grasses, including perennial rye, so that you've got strength throughout the year. Read the labels. Every label has to say what's in there. Find out what it is you need, decide what it is, understand when you can overseed, and use grass seed that matches your needs. Know your weeds. If they spread by seed, don't let it get long in spring before you mow and let it go to seed. There are pre-emergents that can be applied that stop those seeds from emerging if you really are upset about things like crabgrass. Perennial weeds also can grow strongly, especially where the grass is not healthy in a shady area, but if you keep the blades long, often you can shade out these perennial weeds. Don't try and treat when you don't need to. I think a lot of people hate Japanese beetles. It turns out that the lawn can tolerate around 10 per square feet. And it also turns out that the best time to do anything at all, if you need to, is in August, where they're close to the surface and they're vulnerable. Don't go buy products and apply them in spring. The pest is turning into a beetle and it's not going to do anything. Then, if you want less lawn, put in some mulch, put in some paths, put in some perennial beds, make your edges more perennials, put in more plants, put in more shrubs, and you'll have less area to mow. End of the day, mow high, mow less, consider fertilizing or not, go dormant. It's fine. That's what our grasses are intended to do. Some of the people that come in with the worst lawns in fall are the ones that did all sorts of watering and fertilizing, and they have fungal diseases. Choose the right seed and only pesticide if you need. CCE Putnam has really good information how you can replace your lawn with gardens or meadows. It's not just plants, it's also places where pollinators can winter and overwinter. Make it look deliberate. If you're living in a really nice area with a lot of manicured lawns, I don't think your neighbors are going to love it if you suddenly have a mess because you're letting a pollinator garden grow. You have to have a lot of different varieties of sizes and shapes and plants. And if you use pesticides, and you usually don't use pesticides, know when to use them so that you're not damaging the pollinators that you're so desperately trying to attract. That's what I had, and here's other great resources. And I think that's my very last slide. Yes. Back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Joyce. That was, I mean, obviously so much material to cover, all presentations tonight. I think the take home is that there are a ton of resources out there available to everyone, and we're here to share as many of those as possible. You have lots of reading to do and homework. And then also, I would just, Joyce, not to your workload, but I would just encourage anyone to reach out to Joyce. Do you want to mention when's the best time to reach out to you? I know you got.
So you can get to me more ways than anyone can imagine. You can email me, you can call me. We have the hotline on Wednesday morning from 9 till noon, 677-5067. You can go to the website, and if you say gardening, it comes to me. Usually the master gardeners are helping answer questions, but we can't do that right now. But hey, it's summer. And so I've gotten enough experience that we can identify insects, and we can identify pests and diseases and help with general questions. It's what we do. So please feel free to contact me.
Great.
Do you want the screen back, Sean?
I got it. That's fine. Yeah. So we do have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions, and just until we are out of time, and if people do have further questions, we can hang around a little bit longer, but I just want to be time. But so if anyone does have questions for Joyce, Mike, Julie, excuse me, Beth, or any of our other presenters from the other 3 sessions, please feel free to either type in the chat box, or there is the raise hand function. And if you want to.
Can I address Charles's question about 47 acres?
Yeah, go ahead.
Find the book or lectures by Larry. I think it's Weaner. It's not simple to establish meadows, but there are ways to do that. And it's a mix of when to mow and how, as well as how to introduce new grasses and new perennials and other materials. It's hard to do, but it can be done.
Great. Oh, we got an interesting question. What is each presenter's favorite native plant species? Joyce.
I like ninebark now because it's a really cool shrub, and it's deer resistant, and there's all sorts of cultivars that have different colored leaves, and so you can pretend that you're being a la-di-da ornamental landscaper, and yet it's a native.
Yeah. For me, it's milkweed. I love monarchs. So. All right. If there's any other questions, feel free to throw them in there. And I just have a couple more slides here just to wrap us up, and feel free to keep throwing those questions out there. Got a few more slides to wrap everything up.
And Charles, send me an email. I'll find you some resources for meadows. I also have other sources. I do get calls often saying, you know, yeah, I'll find you some more resources on meadows. Also, if anyone's interested, I found a real cool, it's old, but it's cool, resource on establishing a windbreak with a multiple mix of trees and shrubs that can be a privacy barrier, but it's not just like a whole long row of bamboo. It's cool.
Great. We got a question from John Summer. I think this is probably to Beth. Are the buffer and a bag plants jug loan tolerant? I have several large walnut trees along my creek, many invasives that I'm considering replacing if they can stand the walnuts. Not sure if Beth is around to answer that one.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my computer. John, yes, there are some that are jug loan tolerant, and I'm going to not get it right if I guess off the top of my head, but if you want to get in touch with me with my contact information that Sean can give you, or is probably listed somewhere, Sean, I can give you some lists.
Great. Yeah, I'll definitely share everyone's contacts through the list.
And also, if you want to do some homework, I've learned to get pretty good on searches. I would search jug loan tolerant shrubs, and I like to say site:.edu because, or site:.org, and that limits the search to informational sites instead of getting to places where people want to sell you stuff.
Right. Good suggestion. Any other questions? All right, so I'm just going to wrap up again, just here with a couple last slides and just kind of send everyone off. So as we get to this point, and we've kind of been planning and putting together some maps for our property, just want to encourage some next steps. I did post a homework activity for following this session. Obviously, we don't have a session 4, but I encourage you all to take a look at that and keep going with all this even after we're done here. So mapping out your management projects, the goals and outcomes. Again, I'm going to keep hitting home, prioritize. We have a ton of, there's a ton of potential ideas. So making sure you can kind of put some of those to the forefront. Creating a realistic timeline. So this is an example here that I kind of recreated in the homework. Putting down a start and completion date, your best guesses for that. Don't forget to consider costs. Obviously, financial issues can be a challenge or an impediment to this process, so make sure you're considering that. And then getting into it, right? Implementing these projects, tracking your progress, and then considering, if there's maintenance involved with that, and then reassessing or revisioning in future years. So again, just some more resources. These are, just wanted to highlight, again, we cover a ton of material in 6 hours over 3 days. So there's lots of other events and trainings that are going on regularly with our partners. So just wanted to highlight some of these other resources. The Cary Insitute has events and trainings going on all the time. And if you have more questions about that, feel free to check out their website or talk to Mike offline. Of course, CCEDC, our Master Gardeners and Joyce have tons of educational programming going on all the time. And Joyce is a wealth of knowledge, as I'm sure you all know by now, and encourage you reaching out to her with questions. Estuary program, Julie at the Land Conservancy, just some other great programs to reach out to. Joyce mentioned the Lower Hudson Prism, and then also National Wildlife Federation, New York Botanic Garden, and Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So just some great places to look for upcoming trainings and events. I have to throw this in here. Just want to remind everyone, please, if you can, take 5 minutes at some point this week. I will circulate it in an email, a final evaluation, and it's also on that landing page. Again, these really help us to figure out how to best cater these programs to you all, and it's really useful for us. So please take 5 minutes if you can. Thank you. And with that, I just wanted to thank you all very much. I personally really enjoyed putting this together with all the partners and all the panelists. I hope everyone else had a great time, enjoyed it, and learned a lot. And again, we encourage you to please reach out to all of us, any of us with further questions. Hopefully this will become something that we could continue doing in future years, maybe whittle down on some more details and more finer scale information in years to come. So again, we encourage you to keep reaching out to us, and thank you all for your time, and enjoy the rest of your week, and be in touch if need be. And I'll just say, I personally, and I think all the other presenters would echo this, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes if there are any other questions.
And thank you, Sean, and thank you also, Michelle, in the background, for keeping us all able to carry on without knowing all the details of Zoom.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll second Sean and say it was really enjoyable putting this together, and we've been thinking it up for a while. So thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. And thank you so much to all the presenters. We'll clap from afar, and you guys for all your hard work.